I'm Martin Mansergh. I'm from a couple of miles north of Tip Town, where my family, or at any rate ancestors of different names, have lived for 300 years or more. I was born across the water. My father was brought up in Tipperary and in Ireland, but he had an academic career. He was a history professor. So I was born the other side of the water, but wider family was back here in Tipperary. And I visited my first memories are in the 50s. Of a very different Ireland from today, needless to say. And anyway, after I'd finished my education, I came back to the farm, but in '74 did the interviews for the Department of Foreign Affairs and was accepted and spent the next few years as a diplomat with a few years in Germany. And then in 1981 I was brought over to the Taoiseach's office and started working closely. Once Charlie Haughey went into opposition, I had to resign from the permanent civil service. And I suppose I was an advisor to three Taoiseach for 21 years. A lot of it to do with Northern Ireland, but not exclusively so. And I worked with Haughey, then Reynolds, then Bertie Ahern, and I was a back channel to the Republican movement in the late 80s, early 90s. Now it got a reasonably intensive engagement. It was mainly with Martin McGuinness, 92 to 94. I was part of the negotiating team for both the Downing Street Declaration and the Good Friday Agreement, and then the aftermath of it. I mean, the peace process consisted of three phases. Getting to ceasefires, that took about 6 years. Then trying to negotiate an agreement that would underpin those ceasefires. And then, of course, the task, which lasted till 2010, and some people would argue is still going on, implementing what was agreed, because there are plenty of examples of peace agreements that are not implemented, and the peace may or may not survive. So in 2002, I was given the opportunity of, asked actually to stand for the Dáil, which I did. I didn't get elected on that occasion. I got elected a senator though, 5 years there, and then I was elected to the Dáil on the second occasion, and became a Minister of State with responsibility for OPW, the arts, but was attached to the finance as a deputy to Brian Lenihan. I was also a member of the Council of State, personal appointee of Mary McAleese between 2004 and 2011. And then since 2012, I've been deputy chair of the expert advisory group on a centenary commemoration. So it's covering the entire period from the Third Home Rule Bill to independence, the Civil War, and finally admission to the League of Nations. Now, I've published quite a lot of talks. There's the legacy of history for making peace in Ireland. I've been a columnist for, but sometimes monthly, sometimes weekly, the Business Post, the Irish Times for 4 years, and more recently, and I only retired at my own choice at Christmas, the Irish Catholic. So that's, now I'm over 50 years married and have 11 grandchildren, and I divide my time between Tipperary and Dublin, so that's a brief, or not so brief, resume.
Where does your interest in the Civil War, this period, where did that come from?
Sorry, what?
Your interest in the Civil War.
Well, I mean, it's part of the whole decade of centenaries, and I personally have found, being involved in commemoration, but also involved in negotiations to do with Northern Ireland and British-Irish relations. For example, 1998, Good Friday Agreement, it was also the bicentenary of the 1798 rebellion, and I probably spoke as many times about 1798 as I did about the changes to Articles 2 and 3 in the referendum and the Good Friday Agreement. So I find it, and I'm a son of a historian, and my father would have focused particularly as far as Irish history. Now, he went wider than Ireland, but as far as Ireland was concerned, in 1912-23, I mean, his last major book, The Unresolved Question, focused on that period. So I suppose growing up in a contemporary historian's household, I would, and having read some but not all of my father's work, I'm talking about 20, 30 years ago, you could say I might have been given a bit of a head start. And of course, we're situated very close to where some of the action was. I mean, we often go after Christmas dinner, go for a walk to the quarry at Solihead Beg, which is by convention regarded as the start of the War of Independence, I think mainly because it was the same day as the Dáil met in Dublin. But there was, after the Civil War, a Garda superintendent who had rented the house was shot dead by the IRA in 1931, showing that there wasn't a neat closure in 1923. And I suppose Tipperary is the county where really for 100 years, I mean, an awful lot happened. I mean, if you think of the cottage now called the War House, where the 1848 rebellion happened in Ballingarry, I've spoken there on a couple of occasions. Indeed, was involved with Michael Smith when he was Minister for Defence. It was, strictly speaking, his constituency. Getting it purchased by the state and restored, and so sort of available for. And then, of course, insofar as there was an actual Fenian rebellion, some of that took place in the vicinity of Tipperary. I mean, Tipperary was regarded as far the most troubled county in Ireland, way ahead of any northern county in that period. And there's a sort of deep irony in that Sir Robert Peel began his career as MP for Cashel in 1809. Now, his father bought it for him, allegedly for about £3,000. Now, £3,000 in the money of those days, not today's money. So, you know, a six-figure sum we're talking about. Now, this didn't make him, you know, any particularly fond of Tipperary. Indeed, there's no evidence that he ever visited his constituency. And if you know, he instituted in 1814, you know, the precursor of the peelers in the barony of Middlethird, and I think he regarded the people of Tipperary, most of them anyway, as sort of unreconstructed, particularly wicked, etc., etc., etc. But no, I mean, he did have his positive points. He changed his mind on Catholic emancipation, you know, he managed the beginnings of the famine an awful lot better than his successors. So, and of course he, I suppose these would get mixed reviews, founded the Queen's Colleges, which are now the NUI, you know, and increased the grant to Maynooth and so on. But anyway, my great-grandfather was the returning officer for that election in 1809. And two members of my family, wider family, I'm not talking about ancestors precisely, you know, married members of the Peel family. Right. So anyway, if you like, there is, if you go back a couple of generations, you know, a loyalist, unionist background. No, I'm not discounting one or two mavericks. There was one member of the family who attended the inaugural meeting of the Home Rule Association or Home Government Association, I think it was called, in 1870. And actually was sort of minded to stand for election at one of the by-elections and gave way to Charles Kickham. But so I mean, you know, as in all families, you get a bit of spectrum. But my father, I suppose, I mean, he wrote a book in 1934, at the age of 24, on the Irish Free State. Now, it was more, at that stage, he was more a political scientist than a historian, so it was kind of on government structures. He then did a companion volume on the other jurisdiction, which I'm afraid to say he had a bit less empathy with, the government of Northern Ireland, you know. And I think he sort of kind of came to the eventual conclusion that while devolution, as it might apply to Scotland and Wales and not just Northern Ireland, you know, had some merits. You know, the sectarian background in Northern Ireland was such that it was very arguable as to whether it was really working there. So he would have been a kind of friend and correspondent of people like Lord Longford, who was the biographer of De Valera, as well as the first book on the treaty, Peace by Ordeal, and also people like Bishop McNeice, who had been Bishop of Cashel and Waterford, but then went up to Down and Dromore, assuming it was called precisely that at that time. These ecclesiastical titles are subject to change, but who actually took quite a courageous stand against you know, sectarian riots in Belfast in the mid-1930s. And so obviously, I mean, I would have learned a lot from my father. I mean, I can always remember in Barley Cove, we were on holiday there in a rented villa in the beginning of August 1969. and we used to go up to the hotel to watch the television news, and this was when, the Bogside, the Derry, Battle of the Bogside and so on. And we had a bit of an argument with my father, because my father's said comment was, the IRA will be back. And myself and my brother argued, that was 50 years ago, and we felt that my father wasn't sort of fully up to date with things like civil rights, etc., etc. But needless to say, we can tell today who was right and who was wrong, But I mean, I suppose I would have learned from, which was maybe a little bit useful later on, what the culture of the IRA had been. I suppose, strictly speaking, I should say the South Tipperary area rather than Tipperary, such a vast county, and so on, is, but, things like that when they gave their word, they generally stuck to it. And I remember when I was involved in talks which, if that had been exposed at the time in '88, could have led to all sorts of crises and so on. I mean, I was always fairly confident that they weren't going to leak it. I couldn't see that it was in their interest. So in certain respects, I trusted them. Though, mind you, I remember being asked, probably on a local radio station here, now this is in the context of decommissioning and so on, did I trust, what was the question? Did I trust was it the Republican movement, the IRA? I forget the precise question, but did I trust them? To which, and it was one of the best answers I ever gave impromptu to it. I said, well, I trust the necessities they are under. You can always decide to persist in a particular course of action, but you have to, if you're involved in anything political, you have to weigh up what is the cost of doing so. And they did genuinely want to make the transition to politics. But however, we're wandering from the Civil War, I'm sorry. Now, if you...
No, but it's all related, Martin. I'm wondering, I've always asked myself the question, why was it so strong in, say, the 3rd Division, down around Tipperary town? Why was there resistance? Why was there such a strong anti-treaty in that area? Could it have went back to the Cambro-Anglo-Normans? Could it have been tied in with land ownership, apart from the obvious political?
I don't have any great sense. I mean, land was a factor overall, but that I think it was a much more intense factor, particularly in the west of Ireland. And also, I mean, the IRA did not want to get distracted. You see, remember, if you had sort of, and you remember there were kind of, tensions between farm labourers and former tenant farmers and so on. They didn't want to get tracked away onto a different track. You see, I always think that the great benefit of the land revolution, the Wyndham Act, and so on, is it happened before the political revolution. It wasn't complete by 1919. I mean, it wasn't even complete by 1939. But I mean, a substantial amount of it had been done, which kind of diffused it as the lead issue. Now, it was, of course, a factor in different situations, different around the country. But essentially, the IRA, or a lot of them, they didn't want a kind of unregulated land war that, could alienate a substantial amount of their support in the countryside. I mean, people who had benefited from sort of buying out their land and so on. So they wanted to keep it in the main to a political track. Now, that's not to deny that in particular areas that it couldn't have been quite a strong motive. I mean, history is very nuanced and multi-layered. But I mean, the Irish Revolution, it was not led by the land issue. The land issue had been addressed, not completely, it left things, and there was a period in 1922 the British had largely withdrawn. The armed forces, the RIC disbanded, and the beginnings of the Civic Guard were a bit uncertain, unsettled. I mean, there was a kind of argument in which Collins was involved in. You see, he wanted to substantially involve quite a lot of the former RIC, and there was objections to this from the ground. So in the end, there was more the RIC, apart from those who had sort of people like Nelligan and so on who had joined the IRA, and he was of course a future commissioner. It was more an advisory role, but I think if you read the books about the RIC and the Civic Guard, and remember many of them in occupied barracks that hadn't been blown up or that could be repaired, and there were all sorts of manuals and so on. As with all revolutions, this includes, and I'm, as a historian, I actually did my doctorate in relation to pre-revolutionary French history. There is always continuity as well as change. Now, I got that yesterday, and this is an aside. I was at the National Day of Commemoration in Collins Barracks. And as you know, that's meant to commemorate all Irishmen, all women who died in various wars. And I can remember the quite difficult negotiations that there were in the early 80s. Fitzgerald would have been in government, Haughey in opposition, but it was between those two parties to try and get cross-party agreement on this, because you see there'd been pressure growing about attending Remembrance Day ceremonies, as in the 11th of November and so on. But anyway, I was amused. I got onto a Lewis from Connolly Station, and there was a guy who was clearly going the same place as me, and he turned out to be a member of the Air Corps, and he had one or two badges or insignia which showed that. But what fascinated me was that he was also wearing a couple of medals that had belonged to a great uncle. And they each had pictures of Queen Victoria on them, sort of. So imperial wars of some kind or another. Now, since it's all wars, it's difficult to say, sorry, that doesn't qualify, because, but I mean, it shows that over time things sort of blend in, and of course there's always the family issue. I mean, like Bertie Ahern said in an interview, his father was very Republican, and even at the end of his days, when Bertie was in politics, only marginally constitutional Republican. But he had a great uncle who'd been involved on the Free State side. And, you know, Owen McNeill, Michael McDowell's grandfather, I mean, one of his sons was shot in dubious circumstances. He was on the Republican side, on the slopes of Ben Bulben in Sligo, and so I mean, there are kind of all kinds of sort of cross lines or strands in families. But you see, and there was also a kind of, and then this is in some of the sort of memoirs of the period, you know, Todd Andrews in particular, but not only him. When, you know, the truce was achieved, you know, the people who'd been involved in the fighting, many of them reckoned they were the people who should be making the fundamental decisions, you know, not the politicians in Dáil Éireann. And, you know, in the treaty debate on the anti-treaty side, people like Carl Brewer, they greatly overestimated the degree to which you know, the anti-treaty military would follow the politicians or would be disciplined. In fact, they declared their independence of Dáil Éireann a couple of months after the treaty was ratified. And you see, undoubtedly, it was a big thing to digest. You know, you declared the Republic and so on, and then to have to go back on that. Now, obviously, some people find it easier to be pragmatic than others, and so on. You see, the Americans never had to retract their Declaration of Independence. Lucky them. And I think that was quite a lot to swallow. And of course, in a way, it was disingenuous because the British privately recognised for a long time they had resisted what they called Dominion Home Rule, on the grounds that you know, if Canada decided democratically that it was going to leave the Empire or the Commonwealth, Britain wasn't going to send an army to pull them into line. You see, and Ireland was in the kind of unfortunate position is that it was the only compulsory member of what, in theory, was a voluntary association. But now, it was, you see, a part of the problem too was that the relationship between the Dominions, all of them, and London, and at that time, 21, was fluid. It hadn't been settled at that stage. It was within the next 10 years that these are fully sovereign, independent states. And all the time, you know, the British were looking at the sort of read across and so on, to both colonies and dominions. But that situation wasn't tenable. And, you know, De Valera had actually worked out, there's a letter of his to a leading Irish-American activist called Joe McGarrity, quite famous actually, and his correspondence has been published. You know, what his plan B was, you know, if the Republican side lost the Civil War, and it reads very much like what he was actually to do in the 1930s. Now, I'm not saying that we got easily to the situation of being a recognized republic in 1949. It happened in stages, and there was an economic war and so on involved in it. But you see, there were kind of two worldviews clashing. I mean, the Irish side was operating on the principle of national self-determination as enunciated in particular by President Woodrow Wilson. And of course, in practice, he had in mind only the countries of defeated empires, not other ones. The clash between that and the British experience is, well, we will grant concessions over time to Canada, Australia, South Africa, and so on, and Ireland kind of fitted into that. But you see, there were two issues really, I suppose, unresolved, which led to the treaty split. It was that we were not getting full sovereign independence as a republic, and we were not getting a united Ireland. Now, I think you could argue, and of course, today we have the Republic, minus the North, of course, but we still don't have a united Ireland, and that would have been pretty difficult to deliver, and particularly as too late, in my opinion. And here I would be critical of nationalism, whether of the Home Rule variety or the Sinn Féin variety. You see, both declared that they were opposed to partition, though Redmond reached a tentative agreement in 1916, which would have allowed temporary exclusion of the 6 counties in return for Home Rule. But that fell apart because the Southern Unionists in Cabinet opposed it. The opposition, the focus was so much on the opposition in principle, is that there wasn't enough focus on, what area it should apply to. With the result is that unionism, Ulster unionism, was allowed to get away with, the maximum area that suited them. Now, 9 counties didn't suit them. They told the unionists in the Covenanters in Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan, sorry, there weren't enough lifeboats to go round. Sort of that. I think the sort of Titanic analogy is particularly poor taste, but there we are, but they weren't. I think if nationalism said we're totally opposed to partition, but no area, cohesive area that has a clear nationalist majority should be included in Northern Ireland. That might have given pause for thought. You see, Lloyd George privately admitted to his private secretary, nobody here, meaning in Britain, was going to fight over Fermanagh and Tyrone. They would fight over the empire and the crown and so on. But you see, there is the other factor too, which is there was the founder and long-time ruler of Singapore called Lee Kuan Yew. I was out giving an address, centenary address, at the invitation of Foreign Affairs in 2016, and so I thought I'd better read up a bit about Lee Kuan Yew. Now, my father knew him, but anyway, so one of his aphorisms that caught my eye is, why are there so many civil wars in recently independent countries? And the answer is because there was no established tradition, no established new legitimacy and so on, authority which people respected and therefore would obey even if disagreeing with. And then, of course, I think, you see, all liberation movements, tend to be coalitions. Now, in a situation where you're in an existential struggle, you hold together. But once that struggle is over, then people with different tendencies, and I think we do tend to, historians generally, all of us, are inclined to cast the treaty split as just as an ideological struggle. It was a political power struggle too, at the political level, but also the question of, see, by the summer of when the Civil War started, I mean, the leadership had passed out of the hands of the Dáil. I mean, on one side you had General Michael Collins and Mulcahy, and you could even people like Kevin O'Higgins put on uniform in the early stages of the Civil War. And then on the other side you have Liam Lynch and De Valera enlisted as a private. And I think the Civil War, Fortunately, in my opinion, it was relatively limited, and while parts of it were vicious, there were also quite a bit of restraint as well on both sides. There's this wonderful anecdote about two comrades in arms, but now on opposite sides, came to met each other one dark evening, and one of them said to the other, well, I could shoot you or you could shoot me, but what would be the good of that? And there were really quite a lot of people who'd taken part in the War of Independence who did not get involved in the Civil War. And you see, I think while my view would be, there's a lot to be said for the Republican case, it's not something that should have been fought over. Now, to be fair, there were a lot of people on both sides who sought compromise through the draft. I remember the late Sean McBride, who was the one person from that time who I got to know quite well, saying, the draft constitution was the key, but the British, and at this stage policy was mainly in the hands of Winston Churchill, who was always somewhat aggressive or pugnacious in all situations. And he had an ideologue to his right hand called Lyon Curtis. I mean, they were absolutely determined to hold to the letter of the treaty, and the letter of the treaty with knobs on. Like, there's an article in the Free State Constitution about the king being the source of executive power in the Free State and so on. Now, I mean, that wasn't the subsequent reality, but it was just kind of putting people's nose in, and undoubtedly they wanted, you could argue that they wanted, if not civil war, they wanted the Free State to put down the Republicans, and that there were lots of advantages in the Free State rather than them having to do it directly. You see, Churchill, on the other hand, was sort of on his way. He started off as a conservative, he became a liberal minister. He then went back to the Conservative Party in the 1930s. He ended up with the diehards on India, but also Ireland, and he and Lloyd George, Lloyd George was out of power, of course, at the time. I mean, held the view that a fundamentalist view of the treaty is that while Ireland had been given the status of Canada, which was a dominion in the 1921 treaty, what Canada was in 1921 was what Ireland should be stuck to. Now, that didn't pass the House of Commons, but that was the die-hard sort of position. Whereas, the natural thing was, well, they're part of an institution that's evolving and evolving with them. And in fact, both the Free State government and De Valera subsequently made maximum use and was sort of on the kind of the liberal progressive side. Now, when I say liberal progressive, I mean one of the key leaders of that was South Africa, and they weren't liberal or progressive in relation to race policy, even if apartheid hadn't happened quite at that time. I think I came across a Fianna Fáil bulletin 1933, which took the line, I presume this was Frank Gallagher, who would have been the editor of it, he was also editor of the Irish Press, saying that the Civil War was understandable as a protest against tyranny, but it should only have lasted 6 weeks. You see, in a sense, and I mean you can see this very clearly in Tipperary, in the towns of Tipperary, including Tipperary town itself, is the fixed battles, shall we say, were essentially over by the middle of August. It was a sort of six week period, and as you know, the Free State hired boats and landed them in different places, Cork, Fenit, I think, even Westport, sort of behind the line. So, the idea of the kind of Waterford-Limerick line, the Munster Republic, I mean, after that, it was essentially guerrilla warfare, and guerrilla warfare, much more concentrated in some parts of the country than in other parts of the country. But I mean, obviously, it was a pity. You see, I think part of the problem is that where imperial powers, and we still have one or two of them today, take the view that might is right, smaller countries like Ireland and possibly Ukraine make the opposite error of thinking right is might, which is, in the longer term can turn out to be the case, but I mean, fairly rarely in the very short term, and I think there weren't very good assessments of, what the chances were. And in particular, you would find there were very few people who had the deep knowledge of the North that, say, James Connolly had, having been based in Belfast for several years. There were sort of wild assumptions as to what could be militarily achieved vis-a-vis the North. I mean, I would argue that the sort of the surreptitious campaign, led by Collins and Mulcahy in the early summer of 1922, that actually, in a way, strengthened the position of Northern Ireland. Something that people don't, even to this day, don't adequately take account of is feeling or imagining that they're under siege is the most familiar unionist posture. The idea that they are uncomfortable in that situation, in fact, it may be the situation that makes them comfortable. I always remember Molyneux saying in the 24 hours after the first IRA ceasefire that this was creating one of the most difficult situations that unionists would have to face. On the basis is, as long as the IRA was yes, okay, it would create some victims. On the other hand, as far as he was concerned, as far as the British were concerned, and the world in general were concerned, it was relatively black and white, and there was right, there was wrong. Whereas if you got into a political process and a negotiating process, all that became blurred. But there was the idea, sort of terribly naive in some ways, is that if you commandeered an Orange Hall in Dublin, that this would have some impact on the attitudes of the unionist government. It might, but only to sort of strengthen their position rather than weaken it, or the idea that the British, cared about this or that big house being burnt. They didn't. And to be fair, rightly so. But people didn't have a good idea of the wider, and some had more than others. Collins had briefly been a civil servant in London before 1916, and there's this anecdote when he gave his notice to his employer in January 1916 that he was going to join up. The employer had no idea that it wasn't the trenches in France he was going to, but in preparation for rebellion in Dublin. I always think, Collins, I think, is to be credited or blamed, depending on one's viewpoint, with ensuring the primacy of the Department of Finance. He was in the new government system, which lasts to this day, allow me to assure you. He was actually he kind of set the lines for Irish administration in many ways, and he was a good administrator among many other qualities. Himself. But the other thing about the campaign in the north, you see, which kind of casts doubt, is if they were so sure that the treaty and the boundary commission, and the boundary commission was really an exercise of sort of kicking the can down the road, if they were so sure that that was going to grant them 2 counties, Derry, Newry, etc., what need for any sort of destabilization? But you see, I think what one's public attitude might be is not always the same as what one's private attitude. is they had to sort of sell the Boundary Commission, I suppose, as a good thing. But Bonalaw, who was, remember, the majority element in the Lloyd George coalition, was Conservative. Now he wasn't in cabinet, but he was the leader of the Conservative Party, partly health reasons. But he took the view after the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson that the people who had signed up to the treaty, and by definition that wasn't the anti-treaty people, that he had thought that they accepted what we would nowadays call the principle of consent. And that, that was in doubt in his mind. And it's difficult to say that that influenced him and saying, this matter has to be sorted. Now, I mean, the British chose to blame the anti-treaty side for Wilson's assassination, but as the latest biography, the overwhelming evidence, links it directly or indirectly with Collins. And, there were all sorts of reasons why people might have objected to Wilson, but the problem is, whatever the emotional reasons, actions like that, have consequences. So, we set back, as I like to say. I mean, not all things, not all sort of states, organisations start well. I mean, you could say, well, the Civil War set us back, which it certainly did, but I sometimes say, well, the Church of Ireland or England, they started with the divorce of Henry VIII, or indeed, I found the divorce of Henry VIII, and then he solved the problem of not having other divorces. He didn't divorce Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard. He chopped off their heads, which is one way of avoiding the sin of divorce. But anyway, it's not really. You won't find Henry VIII on the Wall of Martyrs in Geneva, or sort of the Wall of the Reformers in Geneva. The people who are up in lights now. I'm afraid you will find Oliver Cromwell, but you won't find Henry VIII. But anyway. So it was a pity. Now, you see, one of the things that I admire, obviously the Civil War went on too long, and Liam Lynch was one of these military commanders who always saw rescue coming from some imaginary source or another. I mean, it's a little bit like, if you read in detail, as I told you, as a French historian, in 1814, when the last weeks of Bonaparte, I'm not talking about the Waterloo period after he came back, but the thing is, he was summoning up imaginary legions from places, and one can think of people subsequently, and I don't want to mention the name, in other words, Liam Lynch, didn't have a realistic view of prospects, and he was, by the time he died, he was pretty much on his own in regard, certainly among people in leadership position. But people like De Valera and Aiken, they sort of quickly took up the reins and said, look, in the interest of order, we've got to have rule by majority and so on. And they wrought the, now, all right, they set terms and conditions which weren't realistic about people keeping arms and so on. But they nonetheless brought it to an end. And I remember using the quote, or at least political leaders using the quote, De Valera, sometime in mid-23, the war, as far as we are concerned, is over. And I think the way the anti-treaty side, the mainstream anti-treaty side, pulled itself together, and then the bulk of it went into forming Fianna Fáil. And you see, Dev said in 1926 is the difference between us and Sinn Féin is simply between those who want, this is the First World War now, those who want to stay in the trenches and those who want to get out and move, if you like. And I think they had to be part of. See, this is one of the things that, in a way, helped alleviate the acute divisions of the Civil War. Is De Valera and Fianna Fáil had, however reluctantly, they had to embrace the reality of the Free State in order to change it. And, that reminds me of Willy Brandt's advisor, Egon Bahr, about the German issue between West and East Germany, saying, and they had a policy of non-recognition like we did. If you want to change things, you have to begin by recognizing realities. And say the Free State was kind of reshaped into a kind of undeclared republic. External association, in a sense, operated to the late 30s and up to 1949, and so I think that probably alleviated. Now, for a long time, Cosgrave and Dev didn't have any relations, but they did eventually, before Cosgrave died. And, obviously in more recent time, the left sometimes keeps, and the media sometimes keep talking about Civil War politics. Civil War politics is long. Civil War history, to a certain degree, is still around, but say in this country, and I'm talking about particularly Tipperary South, but I suppose it extends the county. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have been running councils together in some parts of the country for years. And I'm not saying it's the only combination, but and in fact are generally fairly good friends. That doesn't stop them from acting roles. But you see, politicians do. I got on very well, for example, with Joan Burton, but she could have a serious go at me in the Dawn, and I could hit back, but there's a touch of role playing there, Now, there are certain instances where the feeling goes much deeper, but in general, relations were not as good. But even say in the Senate in the early 30s, the man largely in charge of military pensions for those who'd been involved, was Seamus Robinson, who had been the CO at Solihull Beg and indeed of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. And, you know, he worked with, and he actually praised on the record that had it, you know, the constructiveness of the folks opposite and so on. And so I think it wasn't as sort of black and white and stark as is sometimes came. I'm not disputing that, you know, the bitterness ran deep, you know, for some time, especially for some people. But the idea that that was the case for everybody, I don't know. Now, the other thing to be reminded, to remember, particularly about the Civil War, is that the people, the majority of the people, and of course, a lot of them, in fact, most of them would not have been politically involved much in the debates about the treaty, not in any organisational sense. You know, they wanted to settle down to a new normality. The election showed that, and if the pact hadn't operated, you know, the Republican Party would have done worse, not better, you know. I mean, it operated to a certain extent. And I mean, even Dev accepted also people wanted a return to some kind of law and order, because there was sort of semi-anarchy in the first half of 1922. And you see, once the Civil War started, well, then it was clear there might still be a lot of violence taking place, but I mean, you see, the state wasn't any longer, as it had been the first half of 92, just trying to sort of temporize, etc., to try and keep people on board and so on. So, you know, a grip was it. But I mean, people wanted to get, and you see, I think at local social level, I mean, you know, the change involved, I mean, yes, long term, hugely important, but the immediate change was not as great as all that, you know, it was a bit more than a change of government, such as we have experienced here. But total revolutionary upheaval, it was not, you know. And I think a lot of people, particularly given what we discussed about the land and so on, people wanted to consolidate their position. They didn't want it all thrown up in the air again, you know. You know, with sort of untoward incidents that happened from time to time, like the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins and so on. But I mean, there would be less well-known people who, I mean, there was quite a bit of violence. For example, when Superintendent Curtin was shot dead, and the local rugby club issued a statement of condolence, Cumberland Mom threatened to burn down the clubhouse, you know. You know, people, you know, the Civil War divide was still quite hard-edged until, but then you see in the 30s, you know, the lines got mixed up. I mean, as you know, the blue shirt movement was a bit of a fiasco. So I must say, and I've written this, is I think Fine Gael, instead of being sort of blamed and excoriated for succumbing to the leadership of Owen O'Duffy, should be praised for having got rid of him so quickly. That didn't happen in other places, and even at some sort of political cost to themselves. But he didn't last a whole lot more than a year, and there's an oblique reference. My father sent a copy to various politicians, but including W.T. Cosgrave, of his book on the Irish Free State, and he got a note back from Cosgrave, and I think written the day after they'd got rid of Owen O'Duffy, so there's some reference to that. Things gradually consolidated, but now I suppose one of the costs of the revolution, there were immediate costs in terms of people dead, people injured, emigration, so on, a lot of physical destruction, but a lot of that was repaired in 10 years. I've sometimes privately berated Fine Gael for not taking enough credit for sort of rebuilding, the main buildings in Dublin. All right, they don't look quite the same, but the forecourts, the custom, the skyline, and of course that's what they had to do in Dresden, but after much greater destruction. But the things were sort of put back, and okay, you can argue that the policies were pretty conservative, but you see, one of the things that people don't realise, because it wasn't in the interests of any party or class to publicise it. You had in Ireland I would argue from the 20s to the 50s, a classic post-colonial situation, as you subsequently saw in some African countries, post-independence, is that, a lot of the businesses, professions, land was still in the hands of, the former Unionist, mostly Protestant community. And, it wasn't, or at least the political leaders didn't consider it in the country's interests. Yes, of course, they could all have been got rid of. There was the power to do that, but what would have been the economic consequences of doing that? Zimbabwe doesn't look very good, these days. So, in fact, there was accommodation of the interests of that class of people so that they wouldn't take their money. You see, and most of them that hadn't sort of suffered during the revolutionary period, most of them wanted to stay. Like I found, I was in South Africa in 2000, and we went to a couple of receptions. Now this, I think, was, Cape Town and Johannesburg, but I didn't come across anybody in the white population who was planning to come back to Europe. Despite certain difficulties and and hardships and so on. Now, that gradually changed from, you know, the 60s on, and I mean, obviously there was an effort, part of the sort of protectionism of the 30s was to try and build up indigenous industry, including, you know, ownership by Catholic middle class and so on. Anyway, look, I believe you asked some questions.
It's an interesting one. I suppose home was home for people. That's why they didn't use it.
Sorry, what?
When you mention
Yeah.
people not wanting to leave South Africa, I suppose the unionist population in the south wanted to stay as well.
They did.
Of course
They did. Now, okay, for some of them, especially on the land, it was a struggle. But if you go, there was a, what you might call, a quite substantial professional business middle class in Dublin. And they had been virtually unaffected by the revolution, in the sense that, I mean, unless you'd chosen to be a senator, your house wasn't likely to be burnt and so on. And I mean, I've read one or two sort of memoirs. They came through that period virtually unscathed. Now, right, there were one or two people like, you know, Alan Bell, who was shot during the War of Independence and so on. I mean, people who were sort of too close to the castle, and there were naturally people involved with the security side of things who had to leave after the treaty. But the point I'm making is that when the dust cleared, there was still a lot of social continuity. All right, the power situation had altered. They were now responsible to a government, but I mean, you know, economic forces still naturally sort of played a part. And there was, you see, the other thing too is that the way it turned out, I mean, for the Protestant community, you could still pray in church for the king till 1949, and in fact, in Tipperary it went on until the early 1960s. But anyway, with the Queen. So the break wasn't as. But you had funny things like, you see, when Douglas Hyde was made president, my uncle, who was a member of the, whatever it was called, Cashel Waterford Diocesan Synod there, you know, sent a message of congratulations, or seconded a message of congratulations to Douglas Hyde, who of course was a rector's son. So the sort of symbolic changes demanded of people of the minority were fairly gradual. Now, all right, they might have been, you know, a bit in a world of their own, sort of, but no matter. See, I mean, I think over 100 years, you can, I think, look back with a good deal of satisfaction. Now, all right, the early period was difficult. It was difficult for every country, not just Ireland. I mean, the interwar period was turbulent. The war obviously was traumatic, but probably less so for us than for most other places. And I mean, we were virtually on our own amongst the countries that had become independent in the 1917 to 23 period, in that you know, we survived, and it wasn't. It was quite a tricky job. Irish neutrality, maintain the sort of compromise on the surface, you know, fairly strict neutrality, and that underneath a lot of cooperation taking place. But mind you, I've seen programs when I was in Germany on Swedish and Swiss neutrality. They all had to make pragmatic compromises. Now, with the case of Switzerland and Sweden, more vis-a-vis Germany than Britain. And okay, you can say we were definitely too slow after the Second World War in recognising the changes. But you see, there was also then a tremendous pull from Britain. I mean, because Britain, having to undergo huge reconstruction from the sort of bomb damage, the war. I mean, we all know about the Windrush folks from the Caribbean, but there was a pull. It wasn't just a push factor. I mean, unemployment was quite high here, but there was a definite pull factor. I mean, as indeed there has been since the 10 East, Central and Eastern European countries joined the EU, the population of most of them declined by quite sharp percentages. People taking advantage of the freedom of movement. You see, and this really put the challenge up to is, look, if we want to survive economically and politically, we have to be able to offer our population the same sort of standards as they would get elsewhere. And that's why Lamasse's focus was on what he called economic independence. And then, you know, providentially, the EEC came along, and luckily Britain had an enthusiastic pro-European Prime Minister. Even Margaret Thatcher was enthusiastic. She led the referendum campaign to stay in Europe in 1975 as leader of the opposition. That's, you see, positions change and evolve. People don't remember. But anyway, once we got in, we found it suited. And also, I mean, there are many areas where, I mean, gender equality, which the sort of business community was totally against in the 1970s, you know, equal pay and so on, but also environmental regulations. I mean, a lot of those brought us a lot further forward than we might have been purely by our own efforts. And you see, I think the trick is to find. You see that the post-World War I political configuration, at any rate, of Europe didn't work. It established a lot of isolated, mostly more heavily populated than Ireland, you know, but in principle isolated single sovereign states with had very mixed experience even before the Germans invaded them, or the Russians subsequently. And the trick is to find some kind of suitable overarching mechanism. Now, the Commonwealth and the Empire, I mean, wasn't the right mechanism for us, for historical and other reasons. In any case, it wasn't enough for Britain in the 1960s. I mean, they realized the Commonwealth plus EFTA, you know, they would still be cut off from main European markets. And that's why Macmillan put in his application. Now, they seem to have forgotten all about that since, and thinking that the Commonwealth, but I mean, if you go to places like Australia and New Zealand, they are mainly oriented to the Asian market these days. I mean, there's a vast market in China, but I mean, the huge populations to the north of them. I mean, sending stuff to the opposite end of the earth, and so I'm not sure that the farmers have too much to be worried about in terms of what might now come from New Zealand, you know. I mean, there will be some more than there was, but in any case, the British have decided now that you see, one of the unspoken truths of Irish history, I'm getting near 1:05, is that we are part of Britain's security of food supply, big time, especially things like beef and so on. And I read in the Financial Times last week that maybe the temporary situation that there are no checks on food imports from the EU may become permanent. I mean, you've heard of cost of living crises and so on. I mean, and those are operating big time across the water. I've just spent a week there. They may decide, and they say, well, I mean, what is the point of employing people, to check Irish beef? I mean, if it's defective in some way, I mean, that can be established at various points on the retail line, but they need it. So I think some of the fears of our farmers are probably overstated. Anyway, you had better round up because I'm going to have to leave in 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah. In that period, we just chatted about how things mended themselves in some way, and maybe they weren't as stark as in that Civil War period. I suppose the biggest thing, when we get to know our neighbours, when we get to meet people, when those layers are recognised, I suppose the biggest civil war that's been going on the island is that little line that within the 6 counties.
Well, we avoided, unless you. I mean, we avoided a full-scale North-South civil war. That's good. The other thing is a mantra I will leave with you, which is I've noticed other people quoting it since, but I've been saying for a number of years, is Republican politics is more popular than Republican violence. And you see, when Dev got onto the political track, and indeed when Sinn Féin got onto the political track, they found it was paid many more dividends than paramilitary campaigns, which were not going to work. And in somewhere like Northern Ireland, where you have the majority of the population on the other side, and you're talking about one of the world's leading military powers, even guerrilla, yes, you can cause difficulty, kind of almost never-ending civil war. Though I think, in fact, things that are supposed to be never-ending, they do actually end. I mean, look at ETA. They had to pack it in, and effectively they came away largely empty-handed. I would give credit to the Republican movement leadership is more than any similar group that I can think of, but of course there are dozens of situations around the world, is they managed, with some help, to make the jump, and to make the jump successfully into politics from a campaign, military campaign, that while it would have its ups and downs, essentially wasn't going anywhere. And you see, my view is that eventually, after a lot more deaths, that as people's belief in it faded, it might eventually have imploded. I'll leave you one other anecdote. Father Reed of the Redemptorists, with whom I dealt with, I can tell you actually, when I was a young Protestant, I could never have imagined that I would spend the most important part of my working life in secluded redemptorist monasteries. But anyway, that's one of the ironies of history. But Father Reid used to answer if he was asked, who do I represent? And his answer was, the next person who's going to get shot. And it's quite a strong and effective answer. But hopefully, you see, I think one of the problems with commemoration is you get yourself back into the time, whether it's 1916 or 21, 22, and so on, and you can almost imagine yourself is that nothing has really changed. But actually a huge amount has changed, and some of it has changed because of the lessons on various different sides that people have learned and that they've moved on. You could say the Civil War was a painful learning experience. And, you know, while I respect the idealism of many, but, you know, there were also people who did awful things. You know, it's good that we're able to look back and reflect. And you see, most people are looking at it with just a little bit of sort of reflective distance. And one of the reasons why, in my opinion, the Civil War isn't, remembering it 100 years on, is not as divisive as people might have feared, is that most people recognise that it wasn't black and white. It wasn't the case that all the right was on one side and all the wrong on the other side. And of course there was a third party, as the Taoiseach has reminded us, the British, who were wanting to break up any possible compromise that might emerge, you know, that involved downplaying. You see things, now, you see, I mean, the British turned the other cheek when the 1937 Constitution came in. I mean, the King was removed, there was absolutely no mention, and they decided to turn a blind eye that you know, nothing had really changed, which suited them, and it probably suited us. We didn't want to get into conflict or sanctions or whatever. You see, the abdication crisis helped on those lines, and anyway, so. You know, I mean, the whole period is worth studying because, as I say, it is a learning experience. You know, things done right, things done wrong, unpleasant necessities. I mean, I would regard is there wouldn't have been independence without a war of independence, but there also wouldn't have been independence if there hadn't been. You know, a prevailing doctrine of self-determination, the freedom of small peoples, etc., etc. I mean, the politics and the military sort of came together, and then there was the alternative government, the counter-government that was established, which was really quite effective at sort of neutralising what remained of British rule. Anyway, at that point, I must leave you. Okay.
Thanks for your time.
I gave you the best part of 2 hours. Yeah.
Sit great. Just down there and I'll get a snap of you. One snap of you.